Hi, welcome to 20 projects from 2.5-inch strips that we're doing. We're on to project number 2 out of the 20, and there's more information on my website on GourmetQuilter.com. I'm SusanClaire, the Gourmet Quilter, showing you how we can use some of our 2.5-inch strips, which we all love. So if you're already receiving the pattern, you'll have a pattern this time for project number 2, and we're going to be making a placemat. So placemats are kind of fun, they're always useful. They protect the table, they jazz the table up, they are nice to make, and they're great with 2.5-inch strips. So what more could we want? So I've gone ahead now. I did actually cut some 2.5-inch strips myself. I had this black and white stripe. I'm using batiks. The batiks are really nice to work with. I did have one of these stripes, as it happens, in one of the rolls of strips that I had, but I also had the fabric, so I thought I'd just cut myself a couple of those, but the rest of it is from strips that I had that have come in various rolls at times. I'm using up some of the ones that I have. So what I've gone ahead and done is, if you're having the pattern already, you'll find that there's lots of information there. It tells you how much to cut, what size to cut, and things like that. So I've gone ahead, I've cut everything out. So I've got a backing here, I've got some batting, I've got some strips of a couple of different lengths and some squares and some different. So what I'm making is a second one to go with my first one. It's not going to be a matching pair, but it will be a similar pair so that they will look like they go together, which is why I cut some strips from this stripe, which is going to be my binding, but it's also it's in the table, the placemat as well. So what we need to do is cut out strips. So I'm going to make it a similar layout to this one. So I've got my 3 black and white stripes there. My colour here is different. I didn't have any more of this one, so I'm using this grey. And then I've got a dark on the sides here, which is similar to what was there. And then I've got some different colour pieces to go in my coloured squares. So I think they'll be kind of a fun pair. I also ran out of the grey. So this is where we can use things and it really won't make much difference. So one of my pieces has got a little join bit of the dark, and it probably won't even show. It'll be mostly within the binding, unless I turned it round, of course. But that's kind of part of the charm, I feel, of things like this. Even the binding here has a little piece in it, which I'll show you how to do when we come to the binding. So in the meantime, we really just need to join. We've got the 4 colours, so we really need to join our 4 strips up. So I've started, you put a square on one of the longer strips, and then you put another square on underneath. So I've already started. I'm using my join together patch for one of them. So I'll continue on and I'll go ahead and get those all ready, and then we've just got to join those strips together. So this is a fairly quick and easy project. You could make it longer for a table runner. You could move the patches, alternate them, which side they go, all sorts of things like that. But today I'm making placemats. So I'll go ahead and get my pieces joined up, ready to show you the next stage. So I've gone ahead, I've joined my pieces together, so I've got my coloured squares in there, and as I said, you could easily turn one around every alternate one if you were going to make, well, if you just prefer it that way anyway, or you wanted to make a table runner or some other such thing. But I'm going to have mine all over to one side. So I've gone ahead and laid them all out, so I just now need to join my rows together. So there's nothing terribly complicated about that. So I'll go ahead and get my rows all joined up, and then we can lay it all together with the batting and things and do a little bit of quilting on it as well. But I'll come back when I've got my strips all joined together. So I've gone ahead and I've joined all my strips together. I'm pretty pleased with the way they've gone together. I do find when I'm sewing lots of strips together that I like to just do the pressing when I've just got 2 together, rather than waiting till I've done them all. I just find I get a better result if I do that. I've pressed all the seams so that anywhere there's joins have gone into the plainer strips, so in this case the stripy fabric. So all the seams are pressed away from the piecing as much as possible, and so now we just need to layer that with our batting and some backing, and I've already got mine ready here. My batting is actually a lightly fusible one. It's an 80-20 fusible on both sides, but it's only a very light fusible. So I'm just going to, I find it's particularly good batting. It's the Hobbs 80-20 fusible. I find it really good for small projects like this, because we can iron them together, and you don't really need to do much in the way of basting when you're going to do some quilting on small projects. So I'll just turn it over and I'll iron the backing in place as well, and it just makes life a little bit simpler. Not essential. It's good to have something that's fairly flat when you're doing things that is sitting on a table, so that if you're putting dinnerware and things like that on it, they'll sit fairly flat too. You don't want them bouncing all over the place. I do not want my dinner bouncing around. So that's looking pretty good. And I'm ready to just do some quilting. Now it's a simple design, so I think simple quilting is all that's required. When I did this one, I've simply stitched 1/4 inch either side of each of the main seam lines that go down, and you can't even really see it on the back because I've used a pattern fabric on the back. And so I'm just going to go ahead and just do straight lines 1/4 inch either side of my main seam lines there. So I will go ahead and do that, and then I'll come back and show you how I'm going to put the binding on and put that little coloured piece in the binding. So when I do the quilting like this, I often make the stitch length just a little bit longer as well. So this was normally on 2.5, so I'm going to make it about 3, I think. So my slightly bigger stitch just helps it go through nicely. If you have a dual feed, I've got the dual feed built in on this machine. That's really good. If you don't have one but you have a walking foot, this is a good time to use a walking foot. If you don't have either of those things, that's fine. If you're using a fairly thin batting, the chances are it's not going to matter at all because it'll just feed through nicely for you. But just try and get a nice smooth feed, whichever way you go about it. So I'm just going to keep going and get all the quilting done, and I'll come back and show you. So I'm just on the last of the straight line quilting that I'm doing. This is a fun little project. It goes together quite quickly. So that's all quilted. You can, well, you probably can't see on the back, but it is, I can see my parallel lines on the back. Now I just need to trim that, and we need to make the binding for it. So I can go ahead and trim that up, but I'll show you, I think trimming is fairly straightforward. You know how to trim something like this. So I'll show you how I'll go ahead and get the binding prepared. So on this particular one here, I'm not sure if you noticed, but there is a little coloured piece in here. So we need more than one actual strip to go all the way around this. So because I had to put a join in, I thought I'd make the join a little bit interesting. You could put several joins in with several bits of colour. You could change colour. There's so many things you can do in life. However, I'll just show you how I go ahead putting this one in. So I've got my strips. I like to do a diagonal join when I do my binding. So what I've gone ahead and done, I've still got my selvages. I haven't trimmed anything off at this stage. So I've just pressed a diagonal line, so I've just folded that over, and that's going to be my stitching line. So I've left enough to trim off at this end there, but I want to include this little piece of colour like I have done there. So I would then position this piece, so this is folded, the pattern tells you about the measurements and things, so it's pressed over already, and depending on how much you want to be showing, I had probably a little bit less than 1/2 inch showing there, but you could have it slightly wider, so it's kind of like a little tiny flange in the binding. So you just need to press a line in the piece you're going to join it in with so that you can see where it's going to sit, because you want to decide how much you want to be showing. Well, that's going to be way more than I want. I really only want about that much showing. So I would position my fold where I want it, and you could pin it to it if you wanted to, and then I'm just going to position this here, but you need to make sure that there's enough room top and bottom for that to join in to your next strip as well. And then we're just going to lay this on here so that the fold would come up level with where that piece of fabric is that we're just going to join. I think you probably know how to do this diagonal joining in general. It's just that we're including an extra folded piece of fabric here. So your seam should start and stop at the beginning and end of that, and it should be coming across diagonally. So I'll go to the machine and stitch that. So you want to keep everything as straight as you can, not wonk it around. so that now I've got my binding joined, but I've got an extra strip of fabric in there. So when I do my bindings, I usually trim that off, and I'll do that so that you can see what I'm doing. A 1/4 inch seam allowance I just leave there, and I usually press the seam open because of the bulk. However, when we've got something like this in there, we don't really need extra bulk behind our extra piece, so we can just press it to the one side away from our extra piece. And then I can just trim my binding edges up so that everything is sitting nice and straight, ready for when I join it in. So you just need to have just that little bit of extra length of your colour, and there you've got a nice coloured little extra in your binding, so that when we do this sort of double fold binding, when that comes over, you've got a very nice little extra piece like we have in here. So I'll go ahead, I'll get my placemat all trimmed up and start putting the binding on, and I'll just show you how I go about putting the binding on by machine. So because I'm going to put my binding on by machine front and back, I'm going to stitch it onto the back first and then roll it to the front and stitch it down by machine. Some of you like to put it onto the front, take it to the back and hand sew. I'm not going to do that. So what I like to do is I start my binding with, I've cut a nice straight edge there, and I've pressed over that corner there. So I just like to start somewhere, it doesn't really matter where, and I'm just going to stitch until the end of my little folded back piece, and then I'm going to end off, and then I'm going to fold that over now so that I've got the raw edges even, ready for the double, but I'm not going to start sewing straight away. I'm going to leave a little gap so that when I come round I can tuck my end in down there as well. So I'm reasonably near a corner, so I don't want to leave too much of a gap because I still want to be able to stitch my corner in place. So you probably know how to do corners. Stop 1/4 inch before the end there and take it out, and I'm going to fold it over so that the fold goes straight through the corner of the actual placemat. So you want a diagonal fold, and then you're going to fold it back on itself so that the fold is now level with that edge, but it's now changed direction because we folded it there. So then we can just turn it around and just keep sewing. And so I'll do all 4 corners like that, but I'll keep going for the time being until I get somewhere nearer around the other side and show you how I tuck that end in. So I'm just coming around the last bit. I'm about to show you the end where I just tuck that end in, so I can stitch all the way up onto the bit that we started with, and then I know how much space I've got here now, so I can now just trim this off so that it just tucks in most of the way before the join. So I can just cut that off there now, and then when I come down here I can just position that inside there and just pull this over nicely so that everything's sitting nicely there, and I can just join up my stitching with where I had started previously. So that's the binding on round 1, and so what we've got here now is a nice little folded over edge. You can see that there's a little gap there. You could hand slip stitch that down if you wanted to, but when I've machined it down I find it sits pretty well without having to do anything like that. So my join is over here, which I'm very happy with. So now what I'm going to do is bring it over to the front, and I'm going to come around and machine stitch that all the way down, folding in those corners as I go. So I can show you one of the corners as I go. I'll just start somewhere on the side here so that I can be near a corner. So I'm just stitching on, so I'm stitching onto the binding just very close to the folded edge, and it will leave a line of stitching just inside. You would be able to see it if you looked on the back side. I'm not trying to match it up so that it stitches on the binding on the back, but just inside. So I can just head down towards the corner, and when I'm just about at the corner, I just like to bring that fold all the way down, and then I just bring that up and it should just sit. Now if you wanted to at this stage, You could pop a little pin in there to keep that in place and stitch down till I get onto this side of the binding. Only just on, doesn't need to be on very much, just enough that you can leave your needle in and pivot around. And then I do just like to do a little back stitch just over that corner, just 1 or 2 stitches back, and then I can come all the way along this side and do the same thing at every corner until I get back to the start. So I will see you when I get back to the start. So I've gone ahead, I've finished all my binding. Where I did the little tuck-in join when I was sewing the binding on, yes, there is a little tiny gap there, and you could easily just slip stitch that closed if you wanted to. I don't find it's a problem, so I often don't do that. Where I've got my little piece of colour in, that's folded over nicely and stitched in place, so I don't need to do anything with that either. So I'm pretty happy. I've now got 2 placemats, and they're not identical, but they're very similar. You can see where I did my little wonky join here because I didn't have quite enough of the grey. But I'm also quite happy to have something like that in my projects. I don't think we should not use a whole strip of fabric just because we're going to be 1 inch short. We can just substitute. So that was the placemat. So that was project number 2 of the 20 projects with 2.5 inch strips. So I'll see you again with project number 3.